As a part of the outreach ministry of the First Baptist Church in Shreveport, Louisiana, we are pleased to present our pastor, William E. Hull, speaking from the church's pulpit.
In the eyes of some people, Francis of Assisi is the most beautiful Christian since Jesus Christ. To other people, this gentle saint was a fanatic and a fool, hopelessly impractical, a madman for his faith. You will have to reach your own verdict after the brief words I speak and after your own reading of his life. But whatever that verdict will be, I think we will all agree that Francis was a volcanic shower of spiritual intensity across a dismal landscape. Whatever else he did with his bare hands, and they were always empty, for he was a beggar. He closed the gates on the longest dark age in the history of Western civilization, and he was, by common consent, the brightest morning star of the great medieval Renaissance. His life was embellished with legend. And if you read the stories, you read the little flowers of St. Francis or the Testament or just the biographies, it is harder to separate fact from fiction in his life than any life that we shall consider. But that was precisely because his life was of supernatural dimension. He was living out of a Lord and not the signals of his fellow man. What I'm saying is that the best way to convey his uniqueness when those around him talked about him was to speak of miracles, of the heavenly visions, of hearing voices. He was the kind of man you couldn't quite tell about using ordinary terminology. Now, those of us who live more prosaic lives are deeply suspicious of that poetry simply because we see so little of it when we look in the mirror. But St. Francis was determined to be a mirror of Christ, not of himself or of his fellows. He lived only to be a reflection of the divine. Therefore, with a bow to that skepticism that parades itself as common sense, we shall not speak much of the legends of St. Francis. I would only remark in passing, however, is it enough to talk about a life like this using common sense when he lived such an utterly uncommon life? I cannot conceal the fact, however, that the only way people who knew him best could talk about him was to make him a little larger than life. So hold on, and let me begin with his early life and conversion. And believe me, I'm not exaggerating. I'm going to be as modest as the record will allow. Francis was born in 1182 in the town of Assissi. That's his place. Francis of Assisi doesn't mean of a family. It means of a town up in the Umbrian section of Italy, which is a beautiful mountainous area where the Tiber River arises, deep gorges, lovely countryside. It's a great place to go today if you're ever traveling. His name was Giovanni, which we would call John. John de Bernardone, the Bernardone family. But his mother, Pica, was a French lady that his father had met and married because he was a trader in fine cloth. And he very often went to southern France, where she was from. In fact, when Francis was born, he was on a business trip to France. And when he came back, he took his Giovanni, John's son, and he nicknamed him Francesco, which of course we translate Francis. But it really meant little Frenchman, sort of like we would know some people and call them Frenchy. So he was nicknamed Frenchy, little Frenchman, by his father in honor probably of the country of his mother's birth. He grew up learning both French and Italian as well as the Latin of the village priest, but did not have much schooling. Both Origen and Augustine were enormous intellects. As we shall see, Francis had rather a disdain of learning. That was not to be his contribution. His father was wealthy. He indulged his boy. And during adolescence, frankly, Francis was a typical playboy. He got some rather rakish fellows around him, and they were the high spirits of the town. In fact, they called themselves the Gay Brigade, with none of the connotations of the word gay in America today, meaning rather they were a boisterous brigade of happy-go-lucky cavalier types. Francis' only ambition was to become a prince by proving himself through the chivalry of knighthood. He wanted nothing more than to be a knight in shining armor, and so his father staked him to it. But a series of setbacks began to teach him that there was not a lot of fulfillment in that direction. The first time, the father bought for him the most magnificent coat of armor, shiny, dressed him up, put him on a charger, sent him off with the Assissi army to fight the nearby town of Perugia. That was back when most of the wars were between towns. Francis went thundering into battle, was promptly captured, stripped of his armor, which was, of course, a booty for plunder, clapped into jail, where he sat ignominiously as a prisoner of war for a full year with a lot of time to think. He came back home. This was in 1202, came back home, and by 1204, he volunteered for the army of Pope Innocent III. However, before he could even get to battle, he fell desperately ill and languished for a full year, almost at the point of death from fever in the famous town of Spoleto. There he heard the first of many voices that would begin to haunt him in this period. And the voice said, "Why do you desert the Lord for the servant? Why do you desert the prince for his vassal?" So one last time in 1205, he set out to fight again. This time he was fitted out in new armor, given not only a charger, but a page, a young man, to accompany him. This time, however, before he could even get to the front and either be captured or fall sick, he heard a voice. And this time the voice said, "Go home to serve a master rather than to serve men." So frankly, he wheeled around, went home, and faced the humiliation of a coward who 3 times had gone forth with all of the farewell parties and had yet to get a dent in his armor or to fight a decent battle. This began a 2-year period of deep meditation, soul-searching, accompanied, of course, with the partying of his friends. One night in the middle of the night, they were all racing merrily through the middle of the town when they realized that Francis had fallen behind. They stopped, turned around, went back to find him, and suddenly saw him almost in a trance. They beckoned to him to come on and enjoy their merriment, but they could not get through to his attention. At last, they assumed he had fallen in love and was about to be married. And Francis nodded assent to their verdict, but to himself he muttered that the bride he was about to take was the bride of poverty. During this period, filled with searching, with humiliation, many of his friends looking at him with the jaundiced eye of a coward, 2 things happened to Francis that precipitated the climax of a conversion over about this 5-year period. The first of these experiences came when once more he went out to fight. He was going down the road on his charger in his armor when he saw that he was approaching a leper. He had always had an especial revulsion to the leper. In fact, he wrote very plainly, more plainly than I decided I would quote right after dinner, that the smell of the leper, who of course is afflicted with putrefying flesh, literally nauseated him more than any other experience in life. And so he spurred his horse to ride on by even faster. But as he whizzed by the leper, he said, "I saw in his face a vision of Christ who said he would come in the least of his brethren. And so he reined his horse to a stop, climbed down, and walked back toward that leper. With the kind of impulsiveness that was to be the hallmark of his life, Francis saw the issues of life before him. And suddenly he raced forward, threw his arms, armor and all, around that utterly startled leper and kissed him. And he wrote later in his testament that what had once nauseated him now became the source of his consolation. And he put in his testament at this point, "It was not long after that I left the world." As he began to wash the sores of the leper, one of the problems in that day was, lepers lose their fingers and they couldn't clean themselves. And so Francis began to tend the lepers. He began to work in what we would call a leper colony. But he also began to pray particularly in deserted chapels that littered the countryside in Italy at that time. In one of these church ruins, sitting and praying before a crucifix that remained on the wall, he saw a vision of Christ writhing on the cross, saying to him, "Go repair my house, which is falling down." Now later Francis decides that means he is to shore up the very walls of Christendom, which were sagging under the weight of that dark age. But for the moment he decided the command was literal, that he had been told to fix up this abandoned chapel of St. Damien, which we would just call a miserable little rundown one-room country church. He didn't have any money, so first thing he did, he emptied his pockets of the bit that he had, turned them over to the priest of the chapel. Then he went to town to beg for stones, building stones, and for money. He had been fasting so much that he was ragged and haggard and emaciated. And as he went through the streets begging for the chapel, the urchins of the street began to call him Pazzo, Pazzo, which in Italian meant madman, madman. In exasperation, his aristocratic, well-to-do, mercantile father came, got him, drug him home, called him an imbecile, locked him in a closet for days, trying to break this reckless spirit. And he was not released until his mother took pity and unlocked the closet. The breaking point came because Francis, realizing that he still had not restored that church that the voice told him to rebuild, simply marched off with another burst of impulsiveness to the warehouse where his merchant father kept all of his goods, seized up several bolts of the very finest cloth, went into the bazaar, sold it for quick and ready cash, went and laid the money at the feet of the parish priest. In absolute exasperation, his father decided to sue him to get his money back in ecclesiastical court. And this, of course, is one of the dramatic moments and the final conversion turning point of his life. Ecclesiastical court was held before the bishop of Assissi on the steps of the church, which faced the Piazza Santa Maria Maggiore, the great plaza, what we would call the town square. So everybody in town gathered. Giotto has painted a picture of this. The father, of course, explains how he has had his merchandise purloined, how he has lost money, how his son is not a good merchant. Francis was supposed to be working, selling his father's cloth. The bishop ruled that Francis' motives were good, but his method was unsatisfactory. He would have to give back the money made with the cloth. Whereupon Francis gave the money back. The priest had refused to accept it. He emptied his pockets of all of his money. He then publicly renounced his future inheritance from his father, which would have been very considerable. And then he said, "I will give my father everything he has ever given me, all the money that I have, all of the clothing that I have," whereupon in front of the bishop, in front of his father, in front of the assembled town, he proceeded to strip himself stark naked. He lay every bit of the clothing. It was wintertime. In fact, it was February 5, 1207. And it's cold up there. All of the clothing was in a stack. The little bit of money in his pockets was on the top. Francis renounced everything. The bishop, by the way, took his cape off, his mantle, and tried to provide a little modesty. But then went inside, found some rags for beggars. And Francis walked away. As someone has said, the father won a case and lost a son. Barefooted, Francis walked out into the snow, into the countryside. On the way to the little chapel, he was determined to rebuild. By the way, as he went out, 2 robbers jumped him, tore at his rags, found he did not have a copper on him, were so exasperated to find a man they couldn't steal a penny from that they threw him down in the ditch, which was full of snow. It is said that as he walked out into that cold world, barefooted, wearing only rags, penniless, parentless, without a job or a plan, suddenly he burst into song, the song of the troubadour of God. That was his conversion, 1207. What did he do? Well, in the next 2 years, he succeeded in restoring not only that church, but another church nearby, because his act of renunciation, dramatic to say the least. There's a kind of sacred nakedness about Francis that we'll recur to at least twice before this story is over. 3 times if my clock doesn't run out on me. So they began to take an interest. It became fashionable, even for rather well-to-do people, to bring a stone to help build. So he built the church. And then in February of 1209, he was sitting at Mass when the lesson of the day was from Matthew 10, where Jesus says, "As you go, preach, saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers. You received without paying, give without pay. Take no gold, no silver, no copper for your belts, no bag for your journey, not 2 tunics, nor sandals, nor staff, for the laborer deserves his food." In other words, be totally penniless, itinerant preachers. Francis listened to those words. He heard another voice. He saw another vision. He had a mission. His plan was set. He decided to gather men around him who would be mendicant, that is, utterly indigent, penniless itinerants. That is, they would wander around. Now you need to understand that this is a radically new departure in monastic life. Up to that time, monks had forsworn the ownership of any personal property, but the monastery could hold community property, and frankly, the monasteries had become wealthy. The monasteries were full of jewels. The crosses were like icons with diamonds and rubies. If you've ever been to the New York Museum of Art and seen some of those medieval crosses, that was the richest thing in town. And furthermore, the monks stayed inside those cloisters where they enjoyed the relative security. Now, Francis was breaking both of these. He would not allow his followers to own anything themselves or collectively, and he would not allow them to stay one place, but as Matthew 10 said, to go out across the world. By the time he reached 12, and this is, I have so many stories to tell, he decided he would have to get permission, because he was beginning to be suspected as a heretic since he didn't follow the normal pattern of the monastic orders. And there were over in southern France some people called Waldensians who were heretics living this way. Francis was always obedient to the church, so he walked to Rome, walked right in to see Pope Innocent III. He was dressed in this same ragged garb which he had taken as his habit, the brown, coarse cloth tied with a rope, if you've ever seen a Franciscan. The story has it that Pope Innocent looked at him and frankly smelled him and said, "You need to go roll with the pigs instead of talk to a pope." Whereupon Francis wheeled on his heels, walked right out the door, went and rolled in the mud with the pigs. came back dripping pig mud and said to the Pope, "Sir, I have completed your command." Innocent was impressed. And he suddenly realized, right at a time when defections and heresies were sweeping northern Italy, that he might have an ally. So, to shorten the story, he authorized this order, which is now the Franciscan order, the largest order in the Roman Catholic Church. Francis went back home a hero whom the Pope had endorsed. So now people began to follow him in the short space of 5 years, as one of his biographers say. The rags of that brown coarse robe that had been despised by everyone now was a badge of honor by more than 5,000 people. As the order grew, Francis became more and more restless with its administration. He was never a scholar, and he was never an administrator. So he decided he would go off. The great issue of that day was the Crusades. He decided he would just go off and convert the Mohammedans. The way to do it was to go to the Sultan himself. His first effort, he was shipwrecked. His second effort, he fell sick and had to go home. Finally, on his third effort, he made his way to Egypt. He found the Crusaders. He learned where the Saracens were. One day, to their absolute amazement, he walked barefooted and half naked into the desert, came up to the armed camp of the Mohammedans, asked for the Sultan, and they were so flabbergasted, they didn't have more sense than just to let him go. He walked right up to the Sultan. He preached to him the gospel. And while he did not earn a public confession of faith, he did earn his admiration. By the time Francis came back home, he found that they were beginning to compromise the ideals of his order. They were beginning to let them hold a little money as a group, own some property. He knew that that was wrong in his own mind, and so he gave up the leadership of the movement, became more and more reclusive. That leads, I would say, to the event probably most famous. As a part of this seclusion, he was given the top of a mountain out near Assissi. On the top of that mountain in 1224, he was praying so intensely once that he saw another vision. This time it was the vision of a great crucifix with 6 seraphs, these are fancy angels, at each corner, bearing it down. And the nearer and nearer the crucifix came, the more and more Francis thought he was being crucified. And at last, in total identification with this image of the crucified, he awoke from his trance to find the 5 wounds of Christ upon his body. Here in this palm and in this palm, in his feet and in his side, were open wounds that bled till the day he died. Now, frankly, that's been verified. I'm not explaining how it happened, but even his enemies could not deny. In fact, he tried to cover it up. He didn't exhibit himself. He didn't make a freakish sideshow out of this. You may decide as you please, but he bore these marks until his death. By this time, his endless fasting, praying, walking barefoot in the snow, abusing his own body, mortifying the flesh, had taken its toll. And by the time he was 45 years old, he was at the point of death. He asked to be buried in a cemetery for criminals. But Assisi, of course, planned a great mausoleum that you can visit today. When he was finally at the point of death, I had to leave out the third nakedness. We'll come to that later. He said goodbye to his closest friends. And then he asked to be taken and stripped of every earthly possession, laid naked in a bed of ashes in the form of a cross. And in that position, he breathed his last. I've been talking about contributions, but it took too long to tell his life, so all I can do is number them, and sometime, I don't know, we'll get back to it. Obviously, what is the meaning of his asceticism? Francis totally renounced the materialism of his day. What is the meaning of joy in the presence of asceticism? He called himself God's glee man and was a troubadour of the gospel. singing vivaciously throughout all of the miseries of his day. He did write a canticle to the sun. He did celebrate the moon. He did preach to the birds. Those stories are all true. In fact, he got dropsy in his final illness, and the medieval remedy was to cauterize the face with a white-hot iron. They rubbed that iron across his forehead and his cheeks, and at last they touched his open eyeball. And just before the white-hot iron came, he said, "Brother Fire, I have loved thee for my life. Do thou be gentle to me in this moment." And when it touched his eye, he reported he did not feel a thing. He believed in the unity of creation. He was an ecologist before his time. He was an extremist. He was a fool for Christ's sake. He was a divine madman. Why? The only thing I can say to tie all of those together is he was a man determined to totally turn his world upside down. Everything he was against, his world was for. His church was totally obsessed with materialism. His popes were building the biggest buildings Christendom had ever had. Everybody was interested in materialism. Nobody was interested in love and in lepers and in nobodies. And Francis saw that he would have to totally, radically, and completely live as a fool in order to turn his world completely upside down. All I can say is he was a fool, but he did it.
This concludes Dr. Hall's sermon. We pray that its message has brought new insight to your life. If there is any way that Dr. Hall or our staff may be of Christian service to you, please do not hesitate to call or write us. We will give your inquiry a prompt, courteous, and confidential reply. Our address is First Baptist Church, 543 Ockley Drive, Shreveport, Louisiana, 71106. The telephone number is area code 318-865-8414.